Okay, hey, we're going to do chapter four. Look at a couple things here and then try to scoot through this as quick as we can. Okay, so England in the 1700s, or at least England in the Americas in the 1700s, is going to see this huge rise in the British Empire, right? England's by the 1700s, England's going to be one of the most powerful countries in the world. The British East India Company is going to control trade from um, Asia, and West Africa, and in the Americas, all over the world. They're gonna make England's gonna make tons and tons of money. You're gonna see a huge growth in the population of enslaved Africans that are going to be shipped to North America, and then ultimately, or just the Americas in general, right? But before we get to that, this is the England that we're all familiar with. We have to go back in time a little bit. And if you guys remember, I think it was chapter two, where we talked about the English Reformation and all the religious strife that's going to go on. That's going to cause people to one of the reasons it's going to cause people to leave England and come to America. We have to go back to that time frame. All right. And we go back to the reign of Elizabeth, or even the reign of Henry VIII, or Mary, or whoever. And while we're doing that, Parliament, which is basically it's the Congress of England, right? It's the legislative branch of England. They're going to play a pretty large role in the lives of the common people of England, right? They're going to help to raise taxes for the government, to pay for wars, or to do whatever. They're going to control the public opinions about the magistrates, or the monarchs, or whatever. And so we have that. And this relationship between the king and the queen, the king or queen and parliament, is going to be one of the things that's going to lead to the stability of England during this time frame. However, we're going to have a period called the English Revolution, right? And it's going to start the seeds of it are going to come about after the death of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth dies; she's the last Tudor king, and James Stuart becomes king of England. And he is king, and he believes in this idea of divine right, and he believes that God chose him to rule over England, and there shouldn't be anybody that is going to challenge his legitimacy, right? And so one of the first things that James does or one of the things that he does when he's king, is he dissolves Parliament. He gets rid of them, right? Then James dies, and there's nothing big that happens during James the First rule, other than the fact that he does the King James Bible. If you ever want to know where that is, that's King James right here, right? And then Charles the First becomes king in 1625. And Charles needs money, right? And so he recalls Parliament to raise taxes, and they've been away for a while. And so Parliament agrees to come back on the condition that the king is going to treat them better. And they put together a list of ideas that they want the king to sign, and he does, and it's called the Petition of Rights. And in this Petition of Rights, you have things like Congress must approve tax increases. We outlaw unjust imprisonments. We outlaw the forced military housing by civilians. We outlaw this idea of martial law, in which the king can just dissolve laws, and just be absolute ruler over the military and over everybody else, right? And so Charles the First signs this petition, but then he dissolves Parliament for like 11 years. Right. And there's pictures of Charles. This one down here on the left is my favorite, where he gets all sides of his face. And he probably told the artist, hey, make sure you get my good side. And they're all good. Right. Or Charles riding his horse into your living room. And so for 11 years, it's just Charles the First. And then in 1637, Charles tries to impose the Anglican religion on the people of Scotland. And the Scots are crazy, man. And they revolt. They don't like this idea of being forced into the Church of England. And so Charles needs more money to put down this rebellion. And he calls Parliament up. But, again, if you ask somebody for a favor and then ignore them for 11 years, and then you turn around and come back and ask them for a favor, they're probably not going to be too keen on helping you out. And so for a 2-year period, the king and parliament struggle for power in England, right? Parliament accuses some of King Charles's advisors of crimes against England, and they actually put some of them to death. And Charles tries to arrest different members of Parliament. And then at some point, Parliament decides they're going to form their own army, and they do. And they challenge Charles for the power of England. And we have this we have this English Civil War that lasts for a short period of time. The supporters of Charles are the Cavaliers, and the supporters of Parliament are called the Roundheads. Oliver Cromwell is the leader of the Roundheads, and they fight the forces of Charles. And for our purposes, all we need to know is that the Roundheads win. So Parliament wins this fight for control in England, right? So Parliament, they get rid of the king. They decide they're going to, they get rid of the king. They capture the king. They charge him. They put him on trial. And they charge him with being a tyrant and a traitor and a murderer and just a public enemy and an all-around bad person. And they cut his head off, right? They sentence him to death. And so this execution is really, really, really shocking because never before has a monarch been tried and killed by his own subjects. And so 1600s England, we have this idea that the subjects get to have some say in who's going to rule them. And so this English Civil War signals to rulers all across the country, all across the land, that they have to obey the rule of law, right? And so in 1649, Oliver Cromwell and Parliament, they establish a democratic government known as the Commonwealth. And of course, once they take over, they start to rule England like a theocracy, which means like a government of the church. And they start to impose strict Puritan rules, like they outlaw cussing and Catholicism and illiteracy, and they close down the theaters and taverns. And everybody's a little bit upset with this, right? Because what do we all like to do? We all like to not read, go to the theater and cuss, right? And then have a couple drinks afterwards and talk about it. So we're all upset. And then in 1658, 10 years later, Oliver Cromwell dies, and England's like, well, what are we going to do? And they're like, hey, let's get some cussing and some theater going back into the English way of life, and let's get Charles II back. And so we call up Charles II, who is Charles I's son, and they're like, hey, would you like to be king? And he says, yeah, I'd like to be king because, hey, it's a pretty good gig. And so Charles II becomes king. He opens the theaters and the taverns. He's religiously tolerant. He probably says a couple bad words, and everybody's relatively happy. And then Charles II dies, and then James II takes over. And I know it gets real confusing because you have James I, Charles I, Charles II, James II. Well, just know that James I, not a bad guy. James II, bad guy. Charles I, bad guy. Charles II, not a bad guy, right? And so anyways, James II takes over, and he's much less popular. He's a Catholic, or at least he's feared to be a Catholic. His wife is definitely a Catholic, and many fear that he's going to restore England back to Catholicism. So we're going to go back on this roller coaster of religions, right? The way that I always associate James II is I think James II looks a lot like Robert Plant from Led Zeppelin, and that's why I threw those pictures up there, right? And so in 1688, the people of England reach out to James II's daughter, and her name is Mary, and she's wed to a king or a prince in Germany, part of the Holy Roman Empire. His name's William. And they call him up and they're like, hey, ding, 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 ding. Hey, would you guys like to be king and queen of England? And they say yes, because being king and queen of England is a lot better than being king and queen of a small German empire, right? The small little part of the Holy Roman Empire. And so William and Mary show up on the coast of England, and almost immediately when they land with their army, James II flees the country, and they let him go to France, and he lives out his days there, and William and Mary take over. But hold up, before William and Mary are allowed to become king and queen of England, they're forced to sign something called the English Bill of Rights, right? And so they sign this English Bill of Rights that creates a superiority of Parliament over the monarchy. It says Parliament has to be summoned regularly, so basically on a yearly basis. They give the House of Commons power of the purse. The House of Commons is the lower house of Parliament, and they're the ones that are in charge of the spending, right? The king can't suspend laws. It bars any Catholic from sitting on the throne. It guarantees trial by jury for the English people. It promises the idea of habeas corpus, which is showing up in the news here recently, that hey, you can't be put in prison without being charged with a crime. It also outlaws cruel and unjust punishments. And so these are some of the highlights from the English Bill of Rights. And so we go through these two periods of the English Civil War in which Charles I is done away with, and then the Glorious Revolution when James II is dethroned. And it creates not a democracy, but it creates a limited monarchy in which the Constitution or the legislative body of Parliament puts limits on the monarch's power. And so when we get to the American Revolution, this is going to be very, very important because 100 years from now in our time frame here, the 1680s, by the 1770s, when we get to the 1770s, the colonists in America are relatively upset with the way that England is treating them. And so they go back into their history and they're like, well, what did we do with Charles I? Well, we got rid of him. Well, we can't necessarily get rid of the king if we're the American colonists, but what we can do is we can break away from the king and we can create a new government, right? And so why is that important? Because in 100 years, the American colonists will see the Glorious Revolution and the English Civil War as justification for their own wars of independence. Now, bottle that up, put it in the back of your mind, and then forget about it until chapter 5. We're going to go here, back it up. Charles II is still in power, right? And so we're going to establish the majority of the colonies in the Americas, North America during this time frame. The first thing that Charles II is going to do is he's going to have to pay off the war debts that his father accrued during the English Civil War. And so the best way to do that is Charles has when he becomes king, he has all this land in North America. And so he's going to give tons and tons and tons of land to people that he owes money to, right? And so the Carolinas, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania are all going to become what we're going to call restoration colonies. And these are just going to be restoration. We're going to repay and restore this relationship between the crown and these individuals, right? The Carolinas are going to be the first one to kind of pop up because Virginia is still making tons and tons of money by selling tobacco, and the Spanish are controlling Florida. And so we want to create some kind of a buffer zone between the pearl or the diamond of all the colonies in America, which is Virginia. That's the one that's making money, and the Spanish in Florida. And so we want to settle people in the Carolinas, right? And so the first place we're going to go to Barbados. We're going to take some of the colonists that were already settled there, and we're going to move them into the Carolinas. And we're going to settle Charlestown, right? Charles II, right? And we're going to begin to grow livestock. And then it turns out in the northern Carolinas, we can produce pine tar from trees, right? And this is used for waterproofing ships. And so the main crops that are going to come out of South Carolina are going to be different than the crops that come out of the northern areas of Carolina. And it's going to create two different economies to the point that we're going to split those colonies up. And so the main crops that are going to come out of South Carolina are going to be rice and indigo. Indigo is just a blue dye that's very popular in Europe, and so it's used there. And then North Carolina, we have turpentine and tar and tobacco, and all of those are sold for profit, right? And so very quickly in the Carolinas, rice is very labor intensive in South Carolina, and so that slave culture from Barbados is going to come into the Carolinas along with that, right? And so we're going to have development of slavery in the Carolinas very quickly. By 1715, South Carolina has a majority population of enslaved people, and they begin to pass laws, slave laws, like they had in Barbados, basically making slaves and the offspring of the property of their owners, and slaves can be sold like goods, like regular commodities, right? The native population of the Carolinas, once again, once the Europeans show up, they're exposed to new diseases and they die out. We're going to see the same thing that's going to happen in the New England colonies or the Virginia colonies, the Chesapeake Bay colonies. As the English come and they settle and they take more and more land, there's going to be pushback from the natives, and we're going to have the Yancey War, right? The Yancey Wars are going to break out from 1715 to 1718, and the native tribes try to unify and drive the English out of the colonies, and they're unsuccessful. They're successful at first, then the British reorganize and they're successful, right? They're ultimately able to run the Yancey out. One of the things that is kind of interesting is the Cherokee tribe is actually going to side with the English. And when they do that, it kind of swings the favor of the war and to the British. And so, one of those things of history, what if questions, the Cherokee tribes are obviously going to, face great discrimination from the American from the American president Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. Well, what if in the 1720s they wouldn't have sided with the British? How would things have, come out differently? I don't know if it would have really made a huge difference, but it's possible, right? And so you see that the movement of you see the violence against Native Americans in the southern colonies in Virginia, Maryland, that area, the Chesapeake area. Then in the Carolinas, you also see it in New England. But then in the middle colonies, you really don't see this situation happen, right? Because England and the Netherlands, they fought a number of wars against each other. And eventually the English are going to win and they're going to take over the colony of New York. And Charles II is going to give these new lands to his brother, who is James, who is going to become James II. And we're going to name it James, James, who is the Duke of York. We're going to name it after him. And New York has a wide variety of people, which we've already established. Lots of different folks living there, and this new colony of New York and New Jersey are going to differ because they're going to focus on trade, and their business is shipping and fur trade. And the best way to make that business roll is if you have good relations with the Native Americans, right? And so the settlers in New York and New Jersey have very positive relationships with the Native Americans. And we have the Five Nations of the Iroquois in this region. And there's a little thing you can watch about that. And so in New York and New Jersey, you have relatively peaceful relations between the settlers and the Native Americans. In Pennsylvania, you're also going to have peaceful relations. And this is why. Charles II is going to give a large amount of land to William Penn. And William Penn is interesting because William Penn is a Quaker, right? William Quinn, the Quakers is split from the Puritans over this idea of predestination. They believe that anybody can be saved and not necessarily just the selected few that God chooses. They believe that everybody has a spark of divinity, and so like they have this religion where I'm not gonna say they speak in tongues, but they're overwhelmed by the Spirit. They begin to shake, right? And they reject worldly ranks, and so they don't like your Highness and Sir and Lord and those types of things. The Quakers just call everybody thee and thou, like everybody's equal, right? And so if you really think about it, the Quakers are ostracized all the way back in the 1600s because of pronouns, right? The English crown had persecuted Quakers mostly because Quakers, they're a little bit different and they're pacifists. And so they refuse to fight in wars, and this upsets the English. And so the Quakers originally moved to Barbados. They don't necessarily fit in Barbados because of their ideas about slavery. And so when William Penn gets Pennsylvania, everybody moves there. And so Pennsylvania is interesting because the Quakers don't set up a state church. They truly do believe in this idea of freedom of religion, right? And William Penn promises 50 acres to anyone that can come to Pennsylvania and complete their term of service as an indentured servant, and they're going to get land. And the state of Pennsylvania, the colony of Pennsylvania, is going to buy land from the Native Americans at a relatively fair price, right? And because they're pacifists, there's not this fight between the English in Pennsylvania and the Native Americans, right? And so you have that. So Pennsylvania, you don't have wars or violence with the Native Americans in its early history, right? Pennsylvania is going to become one of the most important cities, have one of the most important cities inside of it, and that's going to be Philadelphia. Philadelphia is going to become the fastest growing city in the New World, mostly because it's a place where poor people from Europe can come and live, or they serve as indentured servants, and then a lot of them will stay. And so Philadelphia becomes this destination for the destitute from Europe to come and find jobs and wealth and prosperity in the New World, right? Um, Quakers ultimately have a moral problem with the idea of slavery, and they work to end the practice of slavery. And it's interesting, and it'll be interesting at the end of this class when we talk about the Civil War, that Pennsylvania is right there on that the borderline between slavery and free states, and it's one of the destinations of escaped slaves. Okay. This is really, really important here. The Navigation Acts. The main purpose of any colony is to make money for the parent country, right? And this is important to know because ultimately what's going to be the lead reason for one of the many reasons for the American Revolution is this idea of taxes. And to begin with, in the early 1600s, the American colonies don't make a ton of money for England, but the caveats of that is they don't cost England a lot of money either. And so you have this situation where the American colonies, they don't cost a lot, but they're not making a lot. And so it's okay. And in 1651, England starts to pass laws to kind of codify this idea that the American colonies should begin to make money, right? And so we have the Navigation Acts, which English ships could only carry goods between England and the colonies, and the percentage of crew has to be 75% English, and items that can only be shipped to England are things like sugar and tobacco and indigo and rice, all the things that England wants to buy and then sell back to the colonies or wherever, right? Then we have the Staple Act, which bars the colonists from importing goods that hadn't been made in England, right? And so you can't buy things from Spain, you can't buy things from France, you can only buy stuff from England. And then you have Plantation Duties Act, which places a heavy tax on goods traded between the different colonies, right? And so, you have some legislation in place on the economic activities of the colonists, right? Um, in 1696, we have like the Navigation Acts 2 that basically allows the English to board ships that they think are smuggling goods. And they have a blanket warrant, and they could prosecute customs violators without a jury in 1696. And so that should upset the colonists in 1696. But the thing is, it doesn't, because the English have these laws on the books, but they practice something called salutary neglect, in which they don't necessarily enforce these laws. They're there, they could be enforced, but they really don't. And so the English kind of look the other way with the colonists. They believe that business works better without these regulations, and everything's kind of cool. And so salutary neglect is this unwritten rule that the British, let the Americans take care of the Americans, right? But what's going to be the problem is what's going to be the problem in the future is when the Americans or when the British start to enforce these laws, and that's going to bring about, um, the revolt that's going to ultimately lead to the American Revolution. Okay, slavery. It's a way of life in the American colonies from South Carolina all the way up to Boston. Slavery, again, is more than just a labor system. It's a way of organizing society in which whites are going to be at the head of the society. And you have basically a never-ending, or I'm not going to say never-ending, a plentiful labor supply in the New World. Charles II creates the Royal African Company, in which basically the King of England oversees a slave buying and trading network that's going to enslave Africans in Africa and ship them over to the New World, right? This is going to come to an end during the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution, however, does not bring an end to the slave trade. It just kind of almost democratizes it, in which everybody in England can participate in the slave trade, right? Slaves are going to revolt in numerous ways. In the Caribbean, they're going to form their own little maroon colonies, where they're going to, run away and create small farms on the interior mountainous areas of the mountains. The Stono Rebellion takes place in South Carolina in 1739, in which you have a literate slave that tries to organize the slaves of South Carolina in an armed rebellion. And when the word gets out, the colony is going to push back and create new laws, which basically puts limits on slave behavior. It prevents slaves from growing their own food, learning to read or write, traveling freely between plantations or other places. If you're a little interested in that, there's some great resources on the Stoner Rebellion. The Gentry Society. Okay, one of the interesting things about America is the fact that, at least in the South in some ways tries to recreate the aristocracy of England. We don't have an aristocracy in America, right? We don't have nobility, we don't have lords and dukes and duchesses and whatever. But one of the ways that you can do that, one of the ways that you can recreate this idea is you can create a society in which the upper crust of society um, doesn't work. And so to be gentry means that you're free of all rudeness, right? That you're a gentleman or a lady. And the best way to show this is that you have other people do your manual labor for you. And so we have that, right? Gentry tries to set themselves apart by buying expensive gifts and displaying fine goods, and they're trying to show off their wealth. They're basically trying to this is going to be your planar class in the South. This is going to be, the top 1% of society that are going to try to, you know, um, show off how good they are, right? The other thing that's going to happen in the 1700s is you're going to have wars for empire in Europe. Like wars are basically seasonal. You're going to have England and France are going to fight a long period of never-ending wars. You're going to have the Hundred Years' War. You're going to have all kinds of different things that are going to happen in the 1600s. You're going to have professional armies that are made up of poor people that are going to go and they're going to fight for the season in the summertime, right? And then sometimes you sometimes you win some land, sometimes you don't, but everybody kind of comes out equal, right? You have King William's War, you have Queen Anne's War, or which is really the War of Spanish Succession. You have the War of Jenkins' Ear, and you have the War of King George's War, right? And all of those typically stay in England for the most part. Like some of them trickle over a little bit into like the Carolinas or into New England and Canada, but for the most part, they're going to stay in Europe. But then we're going to have the French and Indian War, or it's part of a bigger war, global war, which is called the Seven Years' War, in which the British and the French are going to fight for control over lands, not only in the New World, but also in Asia and on Europe's main continent, right? And so the Americans are going to fight not only the French, but also some of the Native American populations. Um, and this is going to be one of the major causes of the American Revolution. And we are going to come and talk about that in chapter 5. Okay, so first 4 chapters are done here. I'm going to let you go. We're going to have your regular chapter assignments, but then you also have your chapter 1 through 4 test. So good luck on that. If you have any questions, please reach out and let me know, and I will see you with chapter 5.